Dan here from Questioning Christianity.
Paul here from Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. In other words, I'm questioning Christianity. Sounds like you and I are the same, Dan.
All about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions.
Connecting the Christian story to life's deepest questions? That's not questioning. That sounds like question begging.
Did Paul invent Christianity?
I did not.
And that's why it really is Christianity and not Paulianity.
Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. And today we're joined by Dr. Robyn Faith Walsh, an expert in the New Testament and one of the speakers at the upcoming New Insights into the New Testament conference.
Next to Jesus, Paul is the most important figure in the history of Christianity, but he's widely misunderstood by the general public, but also among many scholars, many of us. I'm Bart Ehrman, and I'd like to announce New Insights into the New Testament, a biblical conference for those who are not scholars. We have a fantastic lineup of 10 internationally known scholars, each of whom will be giving a lecture with Q&A to follow. Some of these talks will be presenting alternative understandings to Paul, that is, alternative to what most of us have long thought and even taught. Paul was not a monotheist, calling into question Paul's authentic letters. Paul maintained that a person is saved by their works. For Paul, Jesus wasn't the only figure to be exalted and glorified. Paul's understandings of Paul's views of sex and sexuality. Paul was heavily influenced by non-Christian, non-Jewish Greek philosophy. Paul's radical reimagining of time mixed signals on Paul's view of the law. Paul was taking a collection in order to keep Christianity from breaking into two different religions. Paul saw himself as the one described by Isaiah, the prophet, who was chosen to bring salvation to the ends of the earth. As you can see, it's quite a lineup with very interesting topics and superb scholars and good speakers.
To learn more about the conference, go to tinyurl.com/BartCon2024.
I hope to see you there.
And speaking of the Apostle Paul, we're going to answer that age-old question.
Did Paul invent Christianity? Well, that's the charge from a bunch of Christianity's critics. That Paul of Tarsus, the former persecutor of the early church turned apostle to the Gentiles, he simply got the gospel wrong, with Paul's aberrant teaching winning out in the first century against the true message of Jesus, such that Pauline Christianity is responsible for the religion we know today.
I think the key thing to keep in mind is that one of the reasons we talk about Paul as a founder of Christianity is that he does quite a bit to not only conduct outreach to the Gentiles, so bringing this into the consciousness of a broader ancient Mediterranean audience. So not just those who are left behind in Jerusalem like Peter and James. Peter and James are clearly carrying on some kind of movement, but their central figure is no longer there. What we get from Paul's letters is this idea of how to institutionalize, we might say, the church. So we have an idea of a hierarchy, of putting together a collection, of networking people together, of trying to come up with answers to really crucial and pending questions that people have about, how do we even understand aspects of what we are doing here when one of our people who are a part of this group pass away? What does that mean? So I think people understand Paul to be a founder more so than Jesus, the kind of Jesus we see presented in the Gospels, who is there for a very discrete purpose. In the Gospels, he is presented as this wonder worker, as this teacher. And the central feature of the message of those texts is what his sacrifice represents. And it's that covenant that Jesus establishes with the God of the Jewish people that allows Paul to then take that message and repackage it in a way so that it goes beyond those borders. And so I do see Paul as more of the quote-unquote founding figure, also because I think even in Paul you see shades of this. There was an idea that there was going to be a more imminent return. You're not so worried about creating institutional structure and some kind of cohesiveness within a group with hierarchy and so forth. And if you think that the world's about to end, right, you don't have to bother with those.
Right.
Things. What Paul meant.
Right. Don't even take a staff. You're good. Yeah.
Why waste time having board meetings about, X, Y, and Z when you think that this is imminent? And we have to remember that Gospels come after the temple falls. And I've said before, and I tend to still hold on to this. I think when that Jewish war happened and Jesus' return did not happen, there was more of a, okay, we're going to be waiting a while. So you did need some kind of institutionalization. And Paul was one of the earliest figures to give us some evidence of what that looked like, of what was actually going on after Jesus's death to create some kind of institutionalization. Clearly, to my mind, even again in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus doesn't even want you to know who he is when he's going around and encountering demons or healing people or, etc. People are awestruck and confused until about the midpoint of that gospel. So I just don't think that was the central purpose. And I think that you get the institutionalization later. So when we're talking about founding a movement, what you have there is the implication of how do we get to the point where people understand that this is a movement that they can structure their lives around. And I don't think that you totally have that until you get to Paul. And the other thing to keep in mind about all of this is it always bears repeating, Jesus, his immediate followers, the disciples, Paul are all Jewish. So if you're working within that structure, then, Jesus has no need to found a movement that is going to be in competition with Judaism. He's within Judaism. Paul understands what he's doing as a form of Judaism that has outreach to Gentiles, but that's also informed by his reading of the Hebrew Bible, because he believes that Gentiles are also basically Jewish people, children of God who have fallen away. And so he's trying to institutionalize a new view of this. And so for all of those reasons, that's why we see Paul as the person who institutionalizes the movement, less Jesus, who was there as the centerpiece or the symbol of the movement.
Now, this criticism takes various forms. Mythicists obviously don't believe there was a historical Jesus, and they say that Paul invented Christianity wholesale, based off visions of a heavenly figure. Muslims, on the other hand, they do believe there was a real Jesus, who they call Isa, but they claim he was a prophet of Islam. They argue then that Paul invented Christianity by corrupting the true Injil, the gospel, blasphemously elevating Jesus to a divine status as the Son of God who offers salvation from sin. But Judaizers, they're the ones that no doubt have the dominant expression of this charge that Paul invented Christianity. They argue that Jesus' role as the Jewish Messiah was to restore devotion to Torah, and that Paul's gospel to the Gentiles, that salvation is by grace alone through faith alone, and that you don't need to follow Torah in order to follow Jesus, they say that's a dangerous perversion.
Do your reasons for positing that Paul is the founder of Christianity overlap with any of those takes?
No, I still see some flexibility in understanding how new social movements form. So to tie what was going on in the first century and what eventually comes to be known as Christianity to any one later anachronistic view of what the effect was of those events, I think it kind of works at cross purposes for understanding the movement in its earliest phases. So no, I don't think my view actually corresponds with any of those perspectives. It's just looking at how sociologically and from the evidence of Paul's letters, this seems to have taken place, and what we know about what's going on in terms of the gospel's literary objectives, their post-war historical moment, and what they seem to be representing in terms of people's interest in this movement as a moving target. It hasn't, I think, fully been baked into the cake yet exactly what people are making of this, and there seems to be a variety of perspectives and competition about how to move forward.
So what does the Christian story say about whether Paul got Jesus wrong? Did Paul invent Christianity? Well, let me say three things. First, Christianity undoubtedly predates Paul. Even though Paul's letters in the New Testament are our earliest Christian writings, there is ample evidence that Paul's conversion to Christianity came after he was already persecuting the first followers of Jesus. Several places in his own letters, Paul admits the embarrassing story of his violence in trying to stamp out the early church. Now, Christianity must already exist for Paul to persecute Christians, so logically speaking, Christianity cannot be of Paul's making.
So the thing to keep in mind about Paul when he talks about pursuing whatever that means, people who were Jesus followers, is that these were probably not the only people he was quote unquote pursuing. Again, whatever that means. His job was more or less, especially as a Pharisee, from what we can reconstruct here, is to go around and basically make sure that people aren't drifting away from what we might call the orthodoxy of Judaism. And it's a little bit of a dangerous term to use, but what I mean by that is that people are claiming that there are people who are the Jewish Messiah who, in Paul's estimation, are not the Jewish Messiah. And what we know from writers like James Cephas, who's writing about first century figures, not making any specific claims about them necessarily, but just describing what was known about the first century around Judea as well, is that there were multiple people making these kinds of claims, right? So when you have multiple kind of Jewish upstart groups with leading figures, so I'm thinking here about Theudas, even John the Baptist, right? These are, John the Baptist, everybody's fairly familiar with, maybe not so much someone like Theudas, but there are multiple different people who are either calling themselves Messiah, people are calling them the Messiah, they are developing these little spin-off groups of their own, what you might call these different movements. We know that there are different factions of Judaism at this time within that region as well. And so if Paul's going around trying to regulate, how many of these little upstart groups can there be? What do they think? Try to keep people in line. Then you see that what we call Christianity is just one of a number of these movements potentially. So that doesn't necessarily suggest to us that Christianity, I've used the term Big Bang in the past, that Jesus appeared, everybody just automatically converted. It was obvious to everybody, it was self-evident, and then everything moves apace. Jesus was not the only game in town. And so whatever Paul is doing, we don't necessarily have to think about this as exclusive to Christianity. Now, the key to Paul is that he doesn't care that much about what we call the historical Jesus. He just doesn't. If you read his letters, what he cares more about is his understanding of Christ, of the figure that he is claiming he has these post-resurrection appearances and conversations with, this Christ figure who was Jesus of Nazareth. And so I think if we keep that in mind as well, it complicates things quite a bit, because his version of what we might call Christianity is coming from a very, very different place than someone who's connected to the historical Jesus and what we might imagine that historical movement looked like. We only have a little glimpse into what that movement looked like because of what Paul tells us about his interactions with James and Peter. And that's why I said earlier, Paul's mission, if we want to use that term, seems to have been to graft Gentiles into this movement that is otherwise, again, a Jewish movement, centered geographically in a very discrete place. And so I think back to this idea of Paul as founder as well. Is Paul the founder of Christianity? Is Jesus the founder? Neither of them, I think, are envisioning a religion separate from Judaism to tie it all back together. So when we put the label founder on Paul, when we invoke Acts of the Apostles as some kind of reliable history, that's saying more about us than the evidence. That's saying more about what we want this evidence to say than, not to repeat myself, but back to what I was saying before, than what we can extract about a new religious movement, about the sociological composition of that movement, how it gets institutionalized and grows. We put those labels on these people, but we have to try to meet them where they're at as much as we possibly can. And that includes recognizing that Christianity as such does not exist for these people.
And in case you're worried that Paul simply invented the persecution story, the book of Acts, an early chronicle of the church's history, it confirms not only Paul's story, but also details the prior history of the church in the years leading up to Paul's persecutions. So the claim that Paul invented Christianity wholesale, it just doesn't fly chronologically.
To speak about anachronism one more time, Acts of the Apostles is written so much later than the lives of Jesus or Paul that it is in itself something that I think we have to give a great deal of scrutiny before we use as an example of a historical description. Certainly it's closer in time period to the people that we're talking about, but it also has its own biases and interests to present things in a certain way and to fill in some historical blanks. So I think we have to keep that in mind, and I wouldn't use Acts to hang my hat on much historically when it comes to Acts.
Agree.
Paul's gospel was endorsed by Jesus' apostles. Even if you are dubious about who really penned 2 Peter, where in chapter 3 Peter seemingly elevates Paul's letters to the authority of Scripture, the book of Acts recounts how Paul became acquainted with the Jerusalem apostles, and how his gospel to the Gentiles was officially endorsed by the Council of Jerusalem, circa 50 AD. That means James, Jesus' brother, and Peter, the spokesperson for Jesus' apostles, both legitimize Paul's preaching. Paul even recounts how this happened in Galatians 1, where after downloading his gospel by revelation directly from Jesus, he traveled 3 years later to meet with Peter and James in Jerusalem, where he received the eyewitness traditions and gained their endorsement for the alignment of his gospel with their preaching. And even if you think Paul's letters are deceitful and that the book of Acts is biased in Paul's favor, you have to remember that Paul was martyred in the mid to late 60s AD and was outlived by some of Jesus' own apostles, most notably John, the son of Zebedee. If there were any red flags the apostles had about the contents of Paul's gospel, when they had the floor to speak, the truth is they remained silent. Even the next generation of church fathers, people like Clement of Rome and Ignatius, Polycarp and Papias, who were directly acquainted with the preaching and leadership of Jesus' apostles, especially Peter and John, they didn't voice any dissent to the influence of Paul's ministry. None.
You know, what's funny about the way Paul describes those meetings is, you don't want to psychologize your subject matter too much, but it doesn't seem like these guys exactly like each other, to be frank. And I say not to psychologize, but let me just psychologize for a minute for the sake of argument. But it almost sounds like James and Peter are like, whatever, Paul, just do whatever you want. Get out of here. Right?
Yep.
And they seem to find some common ground on things like fellowship meal and being inclusive in the fellowship meal or something along those lines. They do find some points of contact. But, Paul describes those meetings as how much better he is than Peter, what a hypocrite Peter is, about who he's dining with or who he's including. And so maybe Paul did bring in a new perspective to this idea that we've been talking about a little bit of, is this exclusively a Jewish movement or do we bring Gentiles into this movement? How that changes the conversation is it's not about, again, who's the founder of Christianity? When does Christianity start exactly? How do we attribute this kind of authority to these different figures? The question there, I think, becomes a little bit more, and this is something I think is operational in Paul's letters, are Gentiles converting to Judaism? Is this movement about Judaism? And that, I think, is part of what is definitely, Paul may be eventually included in that movement in Jerusalem, but I think the jury is still out. Now, back to Acts of the Apostles. Acts of the Apostles tries to smooth a lot of this over. Because if you only read Paul on those interactions are pretty contentious. As I've been indicating, they don't seem particularly friendly. Acts of the Apostles, and indeed later artwork, iconography of Peter and Paul, tried to resolve this and, again, smooth it over, but make it seem like there's a more cohesive, copacetic origin point for this movement than, again, I think even Paul's own testimony indicates. So I think we want to be careful not to just assume that all these people got along. Again, everything was smooth sailing. I don't think that it was. And I think we have to also factor in the later function of Paul's letters, because another assumption that I think people make quite often is that Paul was successful. We may call him a founder. But was he a founder in his lifetime is also a different question, because what you see in some of these letters, including Galatians, where the Galatians, for the most part, are a group to whom he is writing that he appreciates and is getting along with for the most part. He also tells them he hopes they castrate themselves at one point because he's mad, right? So this is not something that's going entirely smoothly all around. So Paul, as founder in his lifetime, only works if you also assume, back to the Big Bang, that everything just was self-evident and worked smoothly from the beginning. That is not what the letters show us. He hadn't even met the so-called congregation in Rome yet. He was looking for sponsorship to go there. So these groups are not necessarily all Pauline in the way that they're usually described. He can't seem to control the Corinthians at all, just focusing on the letters that we know to be authentic. What happens when Paul becomes quote-unquote founder is something that happens later on. And I think that happens later on in part. You mentioned some of these church fathers and others who accept Paul's word as representative of this movement known as Christianity by the 2nd century. But that's because he wrote it down. You were able to circulate his letters, discuss his vision of Christ, discuss his ideas about how the Spirit works in human action, about the expectation of Christ's return, about the grafting in of Gentiles, about all of those things that are major issues as this movement gains its feet. But because he wrote it down, it's something that can be discussed, exchanged among these other guys who know how to read and write. because otherwise what's going on directly on the ground, the reason I can't say too much about what James, Peter thought, did John live, like all of these questions, the reason they're open questions is because they left nothing behind for us. And so we only have Paul's letters to go on. And that's the other reason that we have to take seriously this claim that Paul is the founder. He is literally the first one who wrote anything down that created some kind of foundation for discussion, for institutionalization and growth.
Which leads to third, Paul is surprisingly aligned with Jesus' teaching. Critics speak of a chasm between the kingdom teaching of Jesus in the Gospels and the gospel of salvation in Paul's epistles. And there are some differences to discuss. But in his book, Did St. Paul Get Jesus Right?, Oxford scholar David Wenham catalogues how often Paul draws directly from Jesus' teachings. In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul quotes the tradition of Luke's gospel about Jesus' last meal with his disciples, and how Jesus imbued the bread and wine of the Passover meal with new meaning as symbols of the new covenant. Here, Paul isn't just quoting Jesus directly. He's receiving the basis of his gospel of salvation, namely substitutionary atonement and the forgiveness of sins, from the theology of Jesus himself.
So is the quoting of the Last Supper tradition in 1 Corinthians 11, does that mean that he's quoting Jesus?
So let me answer this in a way you might not expect. He totally is quoting Jesus. He is getting it from Jesus, from zombie Jesus. He's getting it. He keeps saying by way of the Lord. What he means by this, he did not know the historical Jesus. He makes that clear, and actually it doesn't help him to emphasize that too much, because there are people like Peter and James who did know the real guy, the historical guy. And so Paul does occasionally say, I've heard that Jesus would say X, Y, and Z as a teacher. But when he says he received something by way of the Lord, or he received something from Jesus, he is talking to the resurrected Jesus. That the resurrected Jesus has selected him as essentially a prophet, that he even says that he was chosen before his own birth by God to take on this role. And so that the resurrected Jesus, this Christ figure, appears to him and tells him the things that he wants to have done, or things like this Eucharistic meal that he wants to have institutionalized, and then Paul relates this. There's a scholar named Jennifer Isle who's written about Paul basically having what is called elsewhere in the ancient Mediterranean a divination experience. So he is speaking to this risen Christ figure who tells him things like this, according to Paul. And he relates these in his letters. Now, we know the Gospels are written later, late first century, post-war.
Well, we do.
Yeah, we do, yeah. And some scholars even now date the Gospels even later. Some say we have no evidence for them at all until the 2nd century. So the fact that we even put them in the 1st centuries may be overly ambitious.
Wow, okay.
But let's assume they're 1st century, because that's what the majority of the field has always held, that they're post-war or close to the war leading into the early 2nd century. So let's assume that the Gospels are late 1st, early 2nd century. Is it more likely that Paul is relating something from the historical Jesus and not making that clear? Is it more likely that Paul is lying, that he is talking to the risen Lord or the risen Christ to get this information? Or does it make more sense, back to what we were just talking about, that Paul's letters are circulating, people are reading them and discussing them, and the gospel authors use those letters to describe the things they want to describe about the historical Jesus? And in this period, a divination experience is a legitimate experience. It's an experience of the Spirit, you might say. It's an experience of, channeling the deity of some kind. There's a variety of ways you can describe it. But would an ancient author necessarily distinguish between what Paul receives from the risen Lord or what Paul might have heard from the historical Jesus, whom he never met, right? He would have received that information secondhand anyway, because he did not know the historical Jesus. An ancient writer might not have distinguished between the two. So they might have seen Paul and his divination recordings as a font of evidence that they could draw from to create, in this case, we're talking about what we usually call the Last Supper, that Paul describes that for us. And then the gospel writers end up putting it into the text, I think says more about the gospel writers' sources than it does. And because Paul is just so specific about how he's receiving this information from the risen Christ, I think it's pretty linear.
So just to be clear, you're suggesting that the Gospels were using Paul rather than Paul using the oral tradition about Jesus. Is that correct?
So if you open up a New Revised Standard Version study Bible, you will see a footnote for those passages that we're talking about, both in Paul and the Gospels. And it will tell you more or less, this is a paraphrase, how odd that this is in both Paul and the Gospels. It must have been an oral tradition that somehow made it to Paul, but then also made it to the Gospels. And so therefore you're seeing it in two different tracks from the same Genesis, from the same point, historical point. When, again, it makes far more sense. And again, Paul is just so specific. Paul is very direct. I received this information by the Lord. Here's what he told me he did at that last meal. Paul's unequivocal about it. So the idea that we are now going to fight against Paul's own testimony to say this must be an oral tradition that he got from Jesus, I'll say what I said before, which is that's more about what we want the evidence to say because of our own questions and hangups than what is actually in the text, because Paul tells us exactly where he tells us where he got it from. So yeah, I tend to think that Paul tells us where he got it from. He got it from the risen Lord. He describes it, that you find it a generation later in a story being written about Jesus in the gospel writers who likely had access to the letters of Paul. That makes a lot more sense to me.
In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is expressly interested in the historical nature of the resurrection of Jesus and its implications, drawing from Jesus' own teaching about what his resurrection would mean for those who believe in him.
Paul is interested in the resurrection in those moments, to my mind, as a rhetorical way to indicate his own authority in the situation, so that you do entrust in him the authority to make the claims that he makes about why he should be taken seriously as somebody in this line of prophets who is there to inform this group about the significance of Jesus and his status as Christ and about the Messiah. And especially in Corinthians, it's important to note, not to take these things. I always agitate a little bit when people say, what about the creed? Because that's a term we put on something, right? Because remember, the Corinthians aren't listening to him. He's very angry at the Corinthians and trying to assert himself. So when he does this kind of thing, it's not in a vacuum. We may take some of these passages out and put them in a vacuum because they mean something to us separately. But I would want to think about why it's important for him to make these kinds of statements that interject himself into the trajectory that he is describing and shows that he is part of the arc of history that he is trying to convince these Gentiles they can be a part of.
In 1 Corinthians 7, in his teachings on marriage, singleness, divorce, and sex, Paul switches between Jesus' teaching, which he draws on as authoritative, likely drawn from the tradition incorporated into Matthew 19 and 22, and then his own thoughts on the subject.
No, Paul's not reading the Gospels. The Gospels are coming later. So we already discussed how I believe it's more likely that the Gospels are drawing from Paul, if anything, but Paul's also drawing on cultural currencies, both from the interpretation that he brings to bear, which is in many ways traditional, save his understanding of Jesus as Messiah and the significance of Christ and his own significance in Jewish history. But he's drawing largely from sexual ethics within Judaism at the time, as well as philosophical thought, Greco-Roman philosophical thought. In Stoicism as well, there is this belief that one should have control over themselves. And Paul is a fairly good Middle Platonist, which means he's incorporating Stoic ethics. And that takes on a number of guises. So he's going to be drawing both on his knowledge of Jewish law, as well as philosophical ideas about the emotions and control. And all of that will make their way into his letters and inform his sexual ethic. And whether the gospel writers are then drawing upon Paul specifically for the same information, or these are just ideas that are out there again in the ether, both out there within Judaism and within Greco-Roman philosophy, it's not surprising to me to see those come into any of these, to Paul's letters or into the Gospels, as you talk to people about ethics and a way of living.
His last three examples are all basically variations of the same, assuming Paul got information from the Gospels rather than the other way around.
Further in Galatians and Romans, Paul speaks of God the Father using the familial term taught by Jesus to his disciples, Abba. And in 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul describes the return of Jesus with ideas mirroring his own teaching in Matthew 24, likely with his thief in the night reference to Jesus' parable. And to round this off, in 1 Timothy 5:18, Paul may even be quoting Jesus from Luke 10:7 on the worker being worth his wages. So from the application of Jesus' ethics to his churches, to the articulation of core doctrines like the incarnation, atoning death, and resurrection of Jesus, Paul is surprisingly aligned with the teaching of Jesus himself, especially considering he was never present during Jesus' earthly ministry.
I should reiterate that this idea of maybe he has the cart before the horse, I think is right to some extent, and at least insofar as I believe that Paul's writing before the gospel writers. And so the likelihood that the gospel writers are drawing on Paul is higher in that case than the idea that Paul is drawing on the historical Jesus or the gospels themselves, depending on how you distinguish those two categories of source material. So that's for sure. You're absolutely right about that. The other thing, though, that I hinted at in my last answer is that some of these ideas are just common things that you talk about if you are an ancient ethicist or an ancient philosopher. These are the kinds of matters that you're not going to see exclusive to the Gospels or Paul, frankly. You'll see them in other ancient thinkers and philosophers, and I don't even have to go to people like Plato or some of the Stoics. I could go to people like Philo, who many people also often connect to some of the ethics that you see in early Christianity, because Philo is doing something very similar. He's drawing on the Hebrew Bible and interpreting it through the lens of the intellectual currency of the day, which happens to be, in this case, Middle Platonism, so predominantly Platonism and Stoicism. People are also really interested in the Cynics and the Epicureans. There are other philosophical groups out there who are all doing similar things or having similar kinds of conversations. There's variations on those conversations. But to even put together a text like the Gospels, or to try to figure out what are the things that most commonly going to be the things that someone who is a teacher type in the ancient world, which Jesus was, he's portrayed as a teacher. What are the kind of philosophical ideas that a teacher is going to bring to bear in any kind of accounting of their activity? And so I find it not surprising at all that you're going to find discussions of things like, again, sexual ethics or other matters, both in what Paul has to say, because he is a good Middle Platonist, as well as a Pharisee, which is something I'll be talking about at Ehrman's conference, because I'll be talking about Paul as philosopher. Because in many ways, I think unless you understand, especially if you read him in the Greek, if you don't understand how he's engaging with philosophical lines of thought, you might miss some of his cross-references, his language, the way that he understands things like Stoic physics having particular importance, and how he even understands the significance of Jesus's resurrection. All of those are factors that he doesn't just make a claim based on some kind of historical knowledge. He doesn't make the claim based on speculation. He doesn't even make the claim, based on some of the things we've been talking about in terms of maybe having a divination experience. Often he's drawing on his knowledge of philosophy and physics and the way the world works to be able to make his proofs, especially to Gentiles who maybe don't have the same kind of background in ideas surrounding the Hebrew Bible or Jewish sacred scripture that somebody internal to that religion would have. And so I think we look at the way that Paul actually uses philosophy to help him make his case for his particular reading of both the Hebrew Bible and Jewish scripture, but also the significance of Christ in human events and the significance of, and in fact, here's another thing in Greek, it is not faith in Jesus, but Jesus's faith that has created this new covenant to bring in the Gentiles to this movement and to usher in this new kingdom. All of that, he uses a lot of philosophical thought, including ethical thought, to do that. So it's both that I think Paul is more likely a source and the Gospels are a source for Paul. I think we have to flip-flop that. But it's also that none of these authors that we're talking about, whether it's Paul or the Gospel writers, is doing anything that you can't find some version of in the greater Mediterranean world, whether it's Philo meditating on the Jewish scriptures through the lens of philosophy himself, and he is not a Christian, he remains Jewish his entire life, or whether we're talking about other Middle Platonists, of which we don't have that many, but we do have a few who are bringing in Stoic physics and marrying that with Platonic ethics and trying to figure out a new course for understanding the human condition. And that's something I'll be talking about when I present how we know Paul is a philosopher, including 1 Corinthians 15. I'll be bringing that in to my discussion at Ehrman's conference.
I don't know. You're coming in here and first you said that Jesus isn't special, and now you're saying Paul's not special. I don't know.
No, these guys are special.
That's pretty controversial.
In a long way. I mean, Paul's quite a brilliant mind, I have to say. The way that, especially in the time period that we're talking about, when Middle Platonism, I know this, you're making a joke and now I'm answering you. But the way that Paul is able, in some ways, what he does is very eclectic, meaning that, he's sampling from different kind of philosophical schools of thought that help him make his case. And it's not entirely systematic, but it's very creative. And the way that he is able to draw all of that through his particular reading of the Hebrew Bible, his understanding of how to talk about the faithfulness of Abraham, the faithfulness of Moses, Jesus's faithfulness, all being these points of contact for building this new covenant, and why the Gentiles should be interested, all of that is pretty radical, and I think really compelling, and clearly to some extent it worked. Back to Paul being a founder of what we now call Christianity.
The key takeaway is that Jesus is the founder of the movement that bears his name, not Paul. And that's why it really is Christianity and not Paulianity. And what differences remain between Jesus and Paul are explained both by when their ministry took place and to whom. Jesus preached on the cusp of the old covenant giving way to the new covenant, before his death and resurrection would open the door to salvation for all who believe in him. And Jesus preached almost exclusively to Jews, which is why he encouraged true faithfulness to Torah, in spirit and not just in letter. But Paul preached after the advent of Easter, and predominantly to the Gentiles, which is why, because of Jesus' death and resurrection and what that means for all people everywhere and how we draw near to God, as well as what the Jerusalem Council decides under James's leadership regarding Gentiles being free from the demands of Torah observance, Jesus and Paul, they have some differences in how they preached. But both spoke the same truth about God's good design.
The interesting thing about the way Jesus is portrayed in the Gospels to me, and one thing that I think helps us understand why we date the Gospels the way we do, is although Jesus does, as a character, go to the temple, and I think in part because of where he lives, and as a faithful Jewish person, he likely did at some point in his life, but also in the time period that he lived, the temple still stood. But his teachings, although obviously drawing on Jewish sacred scripture, don't necessarily require the temple. The temple is not necessarily the centerpiece of how to practice a certain kind of ethical life in the Gospels. And I think that gives us some indication of whether or not the temple was still standing. And one reason that I think the Gospels and Jesus, as he's portrayed in the Gospels, may have also been attractive to not just Gentiles through the lens of the things that you're talking about here in terms of maybe a philosophical framework or this old methodology that tends to say that Christianity had to change from Jewish wisdom to Greco-Roman philosophy when it went from a rural setting to an urban one, right? This is a very, very old model for understanding the growth of Christianity. But it says something about an appeal of the message of Jesus and his teachings, again, not just to Gentiles and a Greco-Roman audience, of course it did, but also to perhaps a Jewish audience that's struggling to understand, where do we go from here? And I think that's one thing that repackaging some of, Jewish teaching and law through the character of Jesus, it's almost like a retrospective to an earlier time, but giving authority to what was presumably, back to talking about John the Baptist or Judas or some of these other figures, one of these leading figures of a messianic movement. Let's just assume that that's the case, but doing so in a way that it gives you an idea of how to live an ethical life, understand Judaism, the law, and a life within that greater Greco-Roman world with some changes, in a landscape where the temple is now not. So I think that that's one interesting and unusual way to think about it, because then you're not quite setting up these pillars of there's Paul doing what he has to do to appeal to a Greco-Roman audience. We have to remember that these gospel writers and Paul are writing in Greek. They've been trained in a certain way. They're Hellenized. This is how they know how to talk. Right. This is not about them changing something, right? Or having to conform to something in that way, as if there's a choice. This is how these people were educated. This is what they know. And we shouldn't draw such a sharp distinction, I think, between Judaism and the rest of the Mediterranean world. And in Jesus, what you come to see, both in the Gospels and through Paul's letters, is a figure that can appeal broadly outside of Judaism as well, but also just shows how that divide is artificial, that he breaks down those divides. Because the kind of wisdom that he's proclaiming is something that would have been attractive to a variety of people, not just within Judaism. And the way that Paul describes the significance of Jesus's life and resurrection, death and resurrection in human history, is something that a lot of people could understand, relate to, and find attractive. both because of the antiquity of Judaism and their interest in that, but also because of the way that Paul, being a Hellenized Pharisee in this period, has been educated and knows how to engage what are popular lines of thought through Greco-Roman philosophy at the time. So I don't think we should distinguish between the two in such a harsh way.
Excellent. I think that wraps it up nicely. And now I'm even more excited to see your presentation at the New Insights into the New Testament conference, which everyone can sign up for at tinyurl.com/BartCon2024, or find the link in the description. And if you do, you'll not only be getting a great value in some world-class teaching, but you'll also be helping out the mission of this channel. Thanks again, Dr. Walsh.
Thank you very much for having me on.
And for more of a former Christian taking a look at the claims of Christians, tap on the thumbnail on screen now, and I'll see you over there. Until next time, later.